Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Shao, and I am the Speakers Director of the William F. Buckley Jr. Program at Yale. I'm excited to welcome all of you to our discussion on what is happening to free speech at Yale Law School. In the weeks since the Washington Free Beacon broke the story that Yale pressured a student to apologize for using language they deemed triggering in a Constitution Day party invitation, the controversy has attracted attention from both within and outside the walls of Yale Law School. We are fortunate to have with us today two people who can shed greater light on what happened and the implications of the Yale administration's investigation for free speech at one of the nation's most prestigious law schools. Now, before I introduce our guests for this afternoon, I want to say a few words about the Buckley Program. The William F. Buckley Jr. Program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We host lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2010. Our over 350 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley Program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. Now on to our guests for today. Aaron Sabarium is Associate Editor at the Washington Free Beacon. He graduated from Yale University, where he was the opinion editor of the Yale Daily News and a fellow of the Buckley Program. Aaron was the first journalist to break this story last Wednesday and has conducted follow-up reporting at the Free Beacon in the days since. Our second guest, Robert Shibley, is the Executive Director of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE, a nonprofit educational foundation based in Philadelphia whose mission is to defend and sustain individual rights at America's colleges and universities. FIRE has been in contact with the student that we'll be discussing at Yale Law School today. I'll ask Aaron to start by breaking down the events of the past month, followed by brief opening remarks by Robert and then Aaron again. Afterwards, I'll ask a few questions, and finally, we'll have questions from our audience, you, which you can submit throughout the event using the Q&A feature on the lower panel of the Zoom window. Please join me in welcoming Robert Shibley and Aaron Sabarium virtually to Yale and to the Buckley Program. Aaron, you may begin.
So I take it that the events of the past month are broadly familiar to this audience, but just to recap very quickly, a student who is a member of both the Federalist Society and the Native American Law Students Association at Yale Law School sent an email inviting classmates to his, quote, trap house for a happy hour. He referred to his apartment as a trap house and said that Popeye's fried chicken, among other basic bitch American themed snacks, would be served. It was a very lighthearted email. And within 12 hours, it elicits 9 discrimination and harassment complaints from students who regarded the use of trap house, the fried chicken reference, and even the student's affiliation with the Federalist Society as triggering. The student, his name's out there, Trent Colbert. The student is hauled into the law school's office, or not office, their student affairs office by the discrimination and harassment coordinators at the law school. He's told that his email was deeply triggering and offensive. The diversity director of Yale Law School, Yassine Eldick, explicitly says that his peers were also triggered by his membership in the Federalist Society. And then they proceed to strongly pressure him to send a pre-drafted apology note for his email, implying that if he doesn't send the note, he could face disciplinary consequences and even trouble at the bar. When the student declines to send an email, the discrimination harassment coordinators email the entire second year law class about the incident and condemn it in the strongest possible terms. They characterize this email as racist in their message. And although the student is eventually informed that actually what he said was protected speech and it should be totally fine. No, we would never put anything in the bar about you, blah, blah, blah. You may have been confused. It took the university nearly a month to issue that clarification. And until then, the student was left in the limbo wondering, am I going to be punished for having sent what almost everyone would regard as an incredibly anodyne email?
Robert, you may begin if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me. I want to focus on what FIRE's concerns have been here. And yes, FIRE has been involved with the student for some time after this happened. I want to give you a sense of what our concerns are. First, about Yale's administration and its reaction to this, and also a little bit about the what it says about the culture of Yale Law School for free speech, which is also important. We really should all be alarmed that Yale Law School administrators are willing to bring a student in for multiple meetings where they pressure him to do and say things that he's not comfortable with. Freedom of speech, which Yale does guarantee. Yale's a private school, but like most private schools, it does guarantee free speech to students. It also implies the freedom not to speak. That itself is an expressive act. And so while it's good, and it's very good that Yale decided not to initiate disciplinary processes in this case, and we have seen other universities go further in response to things like this. Softer forms of coercion are still a real problem when it comes to the willingness to speak out about differences on important issues, which is vital at a university and at a law school. I know a little about the latter since I went to law school myself. You can imagine sending out an email that you had no idea would be controversial, and there's no evidence that he did have any idea it would be controversial or that there was any racial aspect to it at all. And then less than 24 hours later, being grilled about it by the Office of Student Affairs. And like I said, I was a law student myself. I know that would have sent me an overwhelming message that my whole career and life plan was at major risk. And regardless of what ended up happening, it would have felt coercive. And I would suggest that pretty much any law student would find themselves feeling similarly if they were put in a similar situation. And what it does is it sends this message that if this is the reaction that you will get to a party invitation you sent that didn't have any ill will behind it, what message does this send to other students, even faculty members or other people on the Yale campus who might want to express dissent on real, meaningful political or legal issues that people are currently disagreeing about vehemently? And we can all think of lots of issues like that. The message from this whole incident, doesn't it indicate that doing anything like that would be a huge risk? And I would question whether a marketplace of ideas, or even if you don't really believe in that, simply a meaningful discussion can thrive in such an environment. The reports and the threat of the veiled threats, I should say, or advice, however you want to put it, about how this might affect Trent's standing with the bar are even more alarming. Obviously, the word of a law school dean could obviously derail a bar application. And then even after all this pressure, I want to point out, Trent, the administration went ahead, drafted up a potential apology letter for him to sign, a letter he didn't ask for. And I think it's kind of amazing that under all this pressure, he did not sign what was effectively his confession, this letter. And I think it's also worth noting here, and this has gone, I think, less remarked, that the administrator who wrote the letter told Trent that I think it's important to say in these first few lines, as someone who's written dozens of these, is that you just want to apologize for any upset, et cetera. It doesn't really matter what the last part of that was. What really struck me was someone who's written dozens of these. I think it's very disturbing that Yale Law School has an administrator for whom a significant part of their job appears to be writing apology letters, and presumably these are for other people, not apologizing for himself. And what it does for me and for FIRE and for people watching, it raises the question of how often other students are put into this situation and induced through either harder or softer means to put their names to things they don't really believe. How often does that happen at Yale? If it does, would you hear about it? Not necessarily. And while most of those concerns I've sort of mentioned would be, they're about individual freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, frankly, since you're being, pushed to say something you might not believe, they would be wrong regardless of the viewpoint expressed. And, Professor Christakis, Nicholas Christakis, also of Yale, pointed out on Twitter that, trying to pressure somebody into signing an apology, an admission of some kind is a sort of act that we roundly condemn when the police or totalitarian governments engage in variants of it. And while, I'm FIRE and I are generally pretty hesitant to compare such things, he's not wrong. It is of the same nature. Finally, I think the fact that administrators brought up and I know students did later as well, his membership in the Federalist Society as some sort of aggravating factor suggests that there's an underlying political factor to this that reeks of McCarthyism. Director Eldick wrote that the emails association with FedSoc was very triggering for students that already feels like FedSoc belongs to political affiliations that are oppressive to certain communities. If FedSoc membership is an aggravating factor that suggests that the person involved has to do more than others would in a comparable situation, then there's absolutely nothing preventing a different administrator or a future administrator from applying different standards to any student because they supported Black Lives Matter or PETA or Bernie Sanders, or for that matter, the ACLU or FIRE. So I would ask, do we really want Yale administrators to have that power? And if they do have it, do we really want them exercising it? Do you trust them to always use it for the benefit of you or one of the groups to which you belong? I would say very strongly that both history and common sense says you shouldn't. Thanks.
Aaron, back to you.
So I want to zoom out a bit and talk about the kind of legal and bureaucratic apparatus that seems to have incentivized and prosecuted this case and many others like it. And the first thing I'd like everyone to just note and consider for a minute is that basically all private institutions in American life are subject to a peculiar kind of legal asymmetry. They're not bound by the First Amendment, because that only regulates, government and government not censoring you, but private institutions can censor whoever they want. So they're not bound by the First Amendment, but they are bound by civil rights laws, including, crucially, anti-harassment law, which really didn't come into its own until the late 90s and then kind of early 2000s. There are sort of initial cases in the 80s that start to carve out the idea of harassment and hostile work environment, and then it kind of grows from there. Obviously, almost by definition, and this is not a bad thing, by the way, but I just analytically, I want you to note, the whole point of civil rights law is that it constrains the associational and, in some cases, locutionary freedoms of private entities. That's why it was instituted in the first place. It's good it was instituted given the time period, but it's important to note what it's doing. It is acting upon private universities to constrain them in various ways. And that asymmetry is really acutely felt by private universities because they receive federal funding from the government. And so they really need to comply with, in particular, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Now, what does this all mean? Well, it means that universities don't really have a legal incentive to protect free speech, at least private ones, because they are not breaking the law if they censor kids. But they do have a legal incentive to investigate and address harassment claims, because if they are shown not to be in compliance with federal harassment law, they can get sued for lots of money, right? And what that does, that asymmetry in the law results in a kind of bureaucratic imbalance of power within the university. As Robert said, on paper, a lot of private universities have very strong free speech protections, and Yale is no exception. It has the Woodward Report. It's very strong. And they also have anti-harassment policies. But it's only the latter set of policies that has an entire bureaucracy dedicated to enforcing them. Yale law has a harassment bureaucracy. That's what handled this case, but it doesn't have a free speech bureaucracy, right? There are DEI officers, but there's no free speech officers, right? That just doesn't exist. And the people in the harassment bureaucracy have an incentive to identify, and some would say invent, and then to address grievances that kind of justify the premise of their offices and thus their salaries. And they also tend to attract people who are more concerned with stopping harassment than protecting free speech, almost by definition. And again, on its own, that's fine. But the problem is that there's no countervailing free speech bureaucracy that's paid and incentivized to identify and address threats to free speech. So all the kind of bureaucratic pressures go in one direction here. And you saw that very vividly with the Colbert case. Not only did it take place through the harassment bureaucracy, but consider what the implication of the harassment claims against Colbert were. The implication is that referring to Popeye's Chicken and Trap House as a member of the Federalist Society might be harassment, that is, might be unprotected speech, that is, might literally be illegal and subject to a civil lawsuit. And if that might be illegal, imagine saying something controversial about the police or any number of other hot button issues, right? The implication of this is really quite chilling. It's not just that he could be disciplined, it's that he may have violated a law, right? And the university may be liable for his violation unless they proactively step in to make a good faith effort to address it. And what I think that should tell you is that, the pushback that Colbert's case has generated with all the media coverage and everyone saying this is excessive, that's great, but it's really the exception to the rule. Because in general, the legal and bureaucratic deck is stacked in favor of overreacting to harassment claims. There are, of course, legitimate harassment claims that should be reacted to strongly, but this was not one of them. And yet, the incentive structure in place means it is rational for Yale to kind of overreact in this way. And it's really not usually all that rational for Yale to go out of its way to protect free speech, because the reality is that they don't have to do anything to protect free speech, and no one can sue them. No one can sue them for censorship. That's just not really how it works. So if you want to address cases like this on the macro level, you need to find some way of making the incentives more symmetric. I'm not exactly sure how you would start a free speech bureaucracy within the university, but something like that would be good because it would create a kind of check on all these bureaucratic incentives. Just think about like the idea of checks and balances in the government. I think it's the same basic principle. There needs to be the free speech policies need institutional heft behind them, and they don't currently have that. And as long as they don't have that, but the anti-harassment policies do, you're going to see these identity-based claims of harassment have just extraordinary power to derail students' life.
Thank you for that, Aaron. And I wanted to start by asking a question that related to Yale Law School and the administration's reaction specifically, before moving on to a few macro level trends that you were just talking about. Robert, I know you talked about how the dean had mentioned that he had written numerous apologies before, and it was a sort of appearance of pressure on the part of the administration on the student. Are there things that you think the administration could have done better in its reaction? Are there things that they did right? How would you react if you were the administrator dealing with this incident?
Well, we know that a lot of harassment complaints were filed very quickly after this email went out. One of the things that FIRE repeatedly urges schools to do is when they do have these a harassment reporting system, which all schools do, some more robust than others, that they have an initial phase of that where they look basically at the face of the complaint and do a determination as to whether the expression that's at issue here, the email, which presumably they had, I'm going to presume that the email was forwarded along with the complaints, or it was, gettable very quickly afterwards. You take a look at that and say, all right, this hasn't actually violated any policies. So, I can tell that just from the initial view of it. So what should we do now? I think in that case, the best thing to do would be to craft a response to the people complaining of harassment and saying, obviously you don't want to tell people that their feelings don't matter, or that, because, we don't know how people feel, right? And we should be considerate of everybody, but to say, we understand, you've reported this. However, it's protected by Yale's promises of freedom of expression, which it certainly is. This isn't a matter for the administration to get involved with. We urge you to, have a discussion with the person at issue here. We're happy to facilitate that in some way, but we're not going to be able to take any kind of adverse action towards this student. A lot of times from administrators, I hear that they feel like that's not a feasible thing to do. I don't think that's true. And I think the example of the University of Chicago, for example, shows that you can, as a university, say, we are not going to take positions on these things. We are going to protect free speech. We're going to, put it sort of front and center, and that there are some things that simply aren't the university administration's business to deal with, because after all, everybody here involved is an adult. There isn't somebody to go to when you have this kind of conflict in the broader society. It's something that students should be learning to do, in college. And certainly by the time they're in law school. So I think that's perfectly feasible. I understand that, it may seem like a tough thing to do, especially when universities are used to reacting in a much more solicitous way. But it's important to remember that, there's people on both sides of this, and often the people that are going to be hurt by, the efforts to censor someone are, it's not just the person that you are dealing with there, but it's that chilling effect that is, communicated to all the rest of the students, saying, you know what, people who think like you, people who, make slip ups, they're not tolerated here. You can't be that sort of person at Yale or at this school. And I think that's contrary to what universities are supposed to be.
On that point of the chilling effect, Aaron, you've reported that some Yale administrators have hinted that the student might face consequences, including trouble with the bar exam's character and fitness investigation, especially as the American Bar Association moves to mandate diversity training in the legal academy. What are the implications for this event for student speech, not just at Yale, but across the country?
Well, so there are a couple. One, and I don't know a ton about this, but I believe there is a either proposed rule at the American Bar Association, or perhaps it's already been adopted, which does sort of tighten regulations around harassment. And if anyone's been accused of harassment, it can become a problem at the bar. There's been a move underfoot to sort of increase the penalties associated with having a harassment claim on your record. And when claims of harassment, even if they're ultimately dismissed, when they're made so easily and college administrations take them so seriously, obviously that's going to have a chilling effect on anyone who wants to be a lawyer. But more broadly, you mentioned that they're trying to mandate diversity training. The thing to see about the American Bar Association is that it's the accreditor for basically every major law school in the United States. So you can't really opt out of what the American Bar Association wants. If they say to be accredited, you have to do X, Y, or Z, every single law school, more or less, in the country, including Yale, including Harvard, including Chicago, Stanford, all the way down to make less prestigious ones, they have to comply. So, and one of the proposals, for example, is that the American Bar Association wants all law schools to teach a professional ethics class that includes a unit on how lawyers have an obligation to rectify racism in the legal profession. So they want to require all law schools to teach a class with particular content, right? Not just conveying some normative obligation to lawyers, but also the implied premise that there is systemic racism within the legal system, right? There's kind of two affronts to free speech there, or to academic freedom. And this is the accreditor of all law schools. So they really do have the power to significantly restrict academic freedom at every kind of inculcator of legal talent in the country. And I would say that's a pretty big deal for the legal profession, and perhaps a reason to reconsider how we do law school accreditation.
Robert, do you agree with Aaron's take on this?
Yeah, I mean, there have in the ABA in recent years, there have been a number of efforts like that, even efforts that are aimed at, frankly, regulating attorneys' speech in their own practice in a way that is unconstitutional. I think that one advantage, I think it is very much worth concerning oneself with. I think one advantage is that lawyers are very litigious. I think that a requirement like that, to the extent that it's coercive, is going to be the sort of thing that's litigated to the bitter end. But I do also think that it's hard to know how a case like that would come out when it comes to accreditation. It's interesting because accreditation itself is a power that's sort of granted by the government. And so there are sort of thorny questions as to what extent government power is being exercised there. And of course, the government also has the power to authorize a different accreditor or to deauthorize a current one. I think that the more that one concern we have, and this goes for not just law school, but for all kinds of professional and even undergraduate schools, is the increasing willingness of people to politicize the regulators is leading to a backlash that's being seen right now, mostly in state legislatures, and I think we're seeing it on the Republican side in Congress. But I think there is a developing sense by legislators that they are going to intervene. I don't really want a system where legislators are constantly intervening in the business of higher education. But at the same time, if we are going to have widespread Democratic, taxpayer support and subsidy for this, there's only a certain amount of sort of misalignment from sort of the mainstream of American opinion and American voters that's going to be tolerated before that kind of intervention starts to happen. I think it is likely to go wrong when and if it does occur. But I also think that the people who are pushing these things really have the response. They are not being responsible with the power that they have. And when that happens, eventually there is some kind of accountability for it. And that accountability isn't always correct either. So I really wish everybody would just put the weapons down and quit trying to drive politics into places where traditionally we agree that you should try to keep it out of. Even if it's not possible to completely keep it out of there, overt politicization of the curriculum is going to get noticed, and there is going to be a reaction. And we can't realistically expect people with political power to keep their hands off of it.
For those in the audience who are joining us late, I just want to remind you that you can submit questions via the Q&A button in the bottom right of your Zoom window. If you just click it and then type out your question and click submit. But I wanted to ask a question asked by one of our audience members today, which noted that the DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Dean of Yale Law School seemed to suggest that the fact the student was Native American was a mitigating factor, and that if he had been white, there would have been harsher consequences. And other audience members have noted that the student was a member of the Federalist Society, and that might have been a potential factor influencing the administration's decision. What do you make of these factors, both aggravating and mitigating? And do you believe that these are part of a larger trend in administration at law schools around the country? Aaron or Robert, you're both welcome to take a stab at this.
I mean, I think it's an awful violation of equal justice under law if that's happening. If there is a bedrock principle, the civil rights law, it's that the color of your skin, your ethnic background cannot be the determining factor in how you are treated by the authorities. And Yale may be private, but I don't think they are. They're certainly not, accepted from the discrimination laws that Aaron was talking about. But from a moral perspective, I don't think you can be excused for treating people differently based solely on the color of their skin or their ethnic background. And to the extent that that's true, and it's always hard to know about these things. That really is very worrisome. Is it a greater trend? I don't know about law schools, but I can tell you that fire itself is seeing an upswing in reports to us of flat out de jure segregation in higher ed programs that are publicly advertised to be only for persons of color for the most part. Occasionally, they'll be marketed as only for white supporters or whatever. And, we take obviously that's unlawful under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but it's also wrong. And that's something that fire is trying to take a hard line against. But we are seeing a growth in that, something I never thought going into this 18 years ago. We'd had a segregation case or two during my time, but seeing the upswing on that is one of the most depressing things that I've experienced in my career, and it needs to stop immediately. And people need to remember that we've seen this show before, where we treat people differently based on the color of their skin, and it needs to stop.
I would just add that it's not only happening on college campuses, it's happening in a lot of institutions. For example, the Republican governor of Vermont signed off on a plan early in the vaccine rollout to explicitly allow people of color to get the coronavirus vaccine earlier than white people, holding age and pre-existing conditions, everything else equal. So that was a Republican governor going along with explicit kind of woke race discrimination. And you also saw the CDC try to do that, where they factored in considerations of racial equity and said, well, the elderly are disproportionately white, so we don't want to just do vaccinations by age. And eventually they kind of backpedaled when someone pointed out that their new plan was going to result in, like, by their own models, needless preventable deaths. But so, you've seen race conscious stuff in medicine. There was also a proposal by two doctors at Brigham Women's Hospital to basically prioritize admission to a specialty cardiac unit based on race, right? What began as maybe soft racial preferences is now in many institutions hardening into just overt racial discrimination, and including in institutions responsible for dispensing life-saving medical services. So yeah, it's pretty bad. It's gone pretty far. You also see it in businesses where, like, there's, this is a more innocuous example, but like, I think Uber did something where they just waived delivery fees for all Black-owned businesses, which I think maybe that's not as legally problematic, but I'm pretty sure that that's still a problem under the Civil Rights Act. But yeah, no, it's widespread. It's the result of this kind of new moral consensus that Wesley Yang calls the successor ideology, that was sort of theorized in the universities under various social and bureaucratic pressures and is now being exported to corporate America and administrative bodies all over the United States.
It seems that we've tapped into a sort of undercurrent that is undergirding this entire discussion, which is that students and many critical theorists in particular have noted systems of oppression along the lines of race. And there are some student groups in reaction to this incident, including the Yale's Dred Scott Society, that have mentioned that the fact that the Federalist Society has had a immensely conservative influence upon our jurisprudence, that in and of itself is oppressive. Do you believe that that's a valid reason for what the administration did or how they reacted, or how should we deal with this moving forward, given the intersection between what people perceive as affronts to their racial backgrounds?
Well, this is another thing that's straight out of the lessons of history, and I brought up vaguely, earlier the McCarthy era, but the complaints about communist subversion of the government and institutions and Hollywood and all of those things were, absolutely identical in character to the kind of complaints that are made along these lines about the Federalist Society and its corrupting influence on, injustice and that sort of thing. To the extent that, frankly, if you remember the time period, the early 1950s were very scary in the sense that the Soviet Union had just recently gotten the atomic bomb, largely from spies here in the United States, helped them build it and passed it along. So this idea of communist subversion and this drive to try to get rid of people who thought wrongly was driven by like real existential fears that we might all die, right? That they, that sort of thing. So if anything, I hate to say, I think it's more understandable for that than it is to be allocating that kind of thing to the Federalist Society. That may just be my opinion, but I don't, it's generally, of the same character, the same idea. And why do we regret the McCarthy era? It's because those smears against somebody simply for what they believed, simply for going out and advocating for the things they believed in, the things they thought to be just, etc. It turned out to be that turned out to be, I think, widely considered to be a societal mistake that we had made. It cost us much more than it gained us. And so, I guess you can always assume that, well, okay, in the past, people were dumb and they made mistakes, but this time we've got the right bad guys. You can make that assumption, but the fact is you also have to grapple with the fact that the last guys made that exact same assumption. And the people before that. So you always think that this is going to be the exception, that the problem that you feel like you're dealing with right now is the exception to this historical trend. But again, 20 or 30 years from now, we may be lamenting this kind of thing and on to doing it to somebody else. It's important to have perspective on these things, but it is always very difficult for people to have that perspective when they're caught up in, the problems of the moment. And again, not saying they're not real problems, but I'm saying that I think uniformly causes more problems than it solves. And it's very unlikely that this time will be any different.
I would just add to that. I think the question Kevin just asked gets at something very important, though, which is that it ultimately is not possible to completely dissociate this debate from the content of what is actually being said. That doesn't mean that you have to decide whether the Federalist Society is right or wrong, but you do actually have to make some substantive claims about what they say and refute certain substantive characterizations of what they say. So for example, if advocating for broken windows policing does in fact count as racial harassment under the Civil Rights Act, if it really does create, a hostile work environment, then it's not protected speech. The First Amendment doesn't protect it, and we really shouldn't allow the Federalist Society to speak, right? To take the position that the Federalist Society should be allowed to speak is not to take the position that broken windows, stop and frisk is good. It is to take the position that it does not constitute harassment and that it is a more objectively rational, reasonable position than its most vociferous critics are making it out to be. I bring that up just because I think in these debates, often especially some people on the right will try to make it all about free speech because they don't want to ever defend. I don't mean just defend the truth of it, but just like defend the reasonableness of certain speech. But the reality is, under not just our current system of law, but also under just like basic common sense about like cultural mores, you do kind of have to offer a defense of the speech at a certain point. You don't have to say it's true, but like, it's not, I mean, like to take on the Dred Scott Society, they might get mad at me, but like, they're just wrong to think that this is, that trap house is, it's reasonable to get offended by this word. And they're just wrong to think that like, you should see the Federalist Society as this like unmitigated source of evil. I mean, you can see it as a net bad. You can think that liberal theories of jurisprudence are obviously better, like fine, but that's not what Dred Scott Society said. They said something a lot more radical, and their more radical characterization is just false and indefensible, and I think incompatible with any sort of pluralistic democratic society. And we should say so. Like, they're wrong. And to go back to Robert's point about how administrators should maybe react when stuff like this happens, yeah, they don't need to like be mean to the kids and say we don't care about your hurt or whatever. They don't need to do that. But they probably should make it clear that they don't regard the claims being made about FedSoc as true or legitimate. Because if you don't make that clear, then, and indeed you sort of indulge the fantasy that this is a reasonable view to take, you really are kind of providing a moral education to kids, but a bad moral education. And as long as universities are in the business of doing that, which they kind of are de facto, I would like them to give kids good moral education and good sort of preparation for democratic citizenship. And part of that is telling kids, no, being offended by the Federalist Society is just not a reasonable thing to get offended about. That's just silly.
Well, and this is part of the reason that we have protections for free speech, is so that discussions like this can happen at all. The sort of eternal quest of the people who are trying to censor, regardless of who those people are, is to try to short circuit having to win an argument by making it impossible to argue the other side. This turns out over and over again, once again, to be short-sighted in terms of actually convincing people. Telling people they just can't express their opinion does not tend to convince them. This part of, in some ways, it's similar to this idea that we're seeing now, and we obviously saw in this case at Yale, but we see over and over, is this urge to, when someone claims to be offended, whether or not it's accurate or not, to say, well, you need to apologize. And that seems to be something that, people are recommended to do, regardless of whether or not they are actually sorry. To just sort of say this particular word, like saying a rosary or something like that. And, it's expected of you. A big advantage of free speech is that when you have it and when you guard it for everybody, you can actually know what people really believe. You have a truer view of the society around you. And I do think that this sort of forced apology situation that we see over and over again, I think it's an attempt to set up a moral norm where people feel bad about doing these things, but I'm confident that what it's doing is setting up a moral norm where people feel like it's they have to lie in order to get along in society. And that is extremely, that's the sort of norm you see in, you saw in the Soviet Union, in East Germany, in places where you have to lie and say, hey, I love the way things are. But inside and with your intimate associates, you resent it. It's corrosive to the morale of a society, and it's not effective. And that's why we have these guardrails. It doesn't feel good to hear people say stuff that trashes your beliefs. I understand that people trash free speech at me. They trash other beliefs I have. It sucks, but we can't have a liberal democracy without allowing that to happen.
Yeah, I would just jump in real quick on that and add that, so as Robert noted, it sort of, the coercion vitiates the value of the apology, right?
Yeah.
If it's not authentic, then like it's not a real apology. But that also tells you something, which is that clearly the people insisting on this don't actually care about a genuine apology, because if they did, they wouldn't be coercing it, since coercion vitiates the whole point. The reason I think that they insist on it is because it's about reasserting a kind of cultural and narrative control, right? It's not actually about repairing harm, because it can't repair harm really when it's coerced. But what it can do is it can kind of serve to reinforce the legitimacy of the social mores under which the behavior was considered harmful. And I think it's that legitimizing function that is really important to see, and which is also somewhat sinister and concerning.
I wanted to bring in another audience question, which asks about the jurisprudence in this area. The question says, is there any hope that the courts will rule directly on the question of whether expression of an opinion, even a racist one, can constitutionally constitute illegal harassment? And if I could take it a little bit further, even if the court ruled to the contrary, to that it did not constitute illegal harassment, will we still see cases like what we saw at Yale Law School in this past month? Aaron, I know you talked about this first. I don't know if you want to give it another shot, or
actually,
Robert, I see you on
Robert might know more about the law, so I'm going to let him go first.
Well, it's a question that seems easy, and it's a good question, but it's also a really hard one to answer, because it is very clear that expressing, I mean, the court has in many cases said that, look, if you're expressing your opinion, in the vast majority of cases, it's not harassment. We've seen that happen over and over again in colleges and universities. The wrinkle, but the part of the issue is that I don't think, because of the nature of our legal system, the question is always, well, what about in this particular situation? What about in that particular situation? Expressing your opinion, one time at somebody is almost always going to be protected, but doing it over and over again, or calling up at 3 a.m. and whispering it, through the phone at them, or throwing a rock through the window with it attached, that's where sort of the action meets. So I don't really think there's any question that simply expressing an opinion is not itself harassment. And it's for that reason that I think, this email would have been a great example of a place where a university that was handling this in a productive way could say, do what I said. And they're like, this just doesn't make it across the mark, unless you've got something else that this person did. This is not part of a pattern of, harassment almost always has to be a pattern of behavior, because otherwise it's generally not harassment. There are some exceptions for really very severe things, but almost always when they rise to that level of severity, they're also just illegal for another reason. Sexual harassment is a great example. Sexual assault is a form of sexual harassment, but it's also illegal because it's sexual assault, right? So that's the problem, is there's never going to be it's already clear cut that it's protected. It's in each of these little situations that the question arises, and universities are great at repeatedly pretending that they had no idea that this particular application was similar enough to the last one that they would have known that what they were doing was unlawful. And they make that argument all the time in terms of trying to argue for qualified immunity, which is the sort of court-made doctrine that says that if you're operating under color of law and you deny somebody's civil rights, if you didn't have reason to know, if you're a government employee and you didn't have a reason to know that what you were doing was unconstitutional or unlawful, that you are personally immune from suit. You can still sue the government agency. And so I remember very well one of our cases, a student of ours, Hayden Barnes, and this actually prompted him to become a lawyer. So it tells you don't mess with this kind of thing. He's an environmentalist student at Valdosta State back in like 2000, I want to say 5 or 7. He literally posted a collage on Facebook. He was an environmentalist. He was against building 2 parking garages. And this is a state university in Georgia. And the president expelled him, just summarily expelled him for doing that, labeled him a clear and present danger, and expelled him immediately. Like they slipped the thing under his door saying, "You're too dangerous, get out." We had to argue over qualified immunity there for, I think it ended up taking 5 to 7 years to get it up there. And we did eventually, Fire was sponsoring this case and working with someone. We eventually got, the appeals court to agree that, okay, yes, we do think that there is enough law out there to tell a university president he can't just a state university president, he can't just haul off and expel somebody because he doesn't like a collage. But the fact that took 5 to 7 years to establish that, dead obvious principle is, I think, part of, the problem in dealing with this. So that was probably a longer answer than you wanted for that. I apologize.
Well, yeah, I think it points to another issue here, which is that the process is the punishment, right? So in this case, Colbert's not facing any formal discipline, but he had to spend a month of his life wondering, am I going to be screwed over at the bar, and going to all these meetings and in a state of uncertainty while he's trying to be a full-time law student. And he had the administration publicly condemn him as a racist, right? All of that clearly constitutes a kind of sanction. And it's tough because as long as you have this sort of harassment reporting mechanism, the only way that you can really prevent it from becoming this like tool to just sort of harass other people is if the harassment office, is pretty circumspect with what it lets through and, has a strong sense of what is and is not harassment. But as we've seen, there's like a built-in incentive for these harassment offices to broaden the definition of harassment, in part to justify their own existence and their own salaries. I guess the only other thing I would add is, another possible restriction that could limit some of this stuff that I believe Professor Eugene Volokh at UCLA Law School has proposed is you could specify, court should rule that it can only be harassment if it's targeted at an individual. And so if there's no identifiable target, you can't rule it harassment. But that is a more restrictive interpretation of harassment law than, for example, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has embraced. So, that's the other thing, like there's different government bodies. The EEOC has kind of a more liberal definition of what counts as harassment. Some law professors have a more conservative one. And because, as Robert was saying, we have this sort of very fragmented system of law, the different interpretations can really predominate in lots of different situations, and it's very hard to predict which one will win out. And so, of course, big institutions like Yale have an incentive to err on the safe side. And that's really part of where the incentive comes in to over punish these cases.
We're coming up close to the end of this event, so I just want to get through a couple more audience questions while we still have time. One audience member asks, what should we make of university policy language like microaggressions? Should we welcome those policies, or how should we react to them? Robert, I'd be curious specifically as to your experience at Fire dealing with students who have been caught up in these.
Yeah, I mean, my experience at Fire obviously is not wholly representative because people come to us when they are, getting in serious trouble. The microaggressions is in many ways just old wine in new bottles. It's being impolite. It's a different way of putting it. It's a way of putting it that sort of puts it on the same footing. I think it's a rhetorical sort of trick that puts it on the same footing as aggression, which has this, this connotation of violence. That therefore a microaggression is somewhere on the scale of murder on one side On the very opposite side is microaggressions, but it's all the same, it's just like a really severe, it's a severity scale. I think often when you are putting things like that, I think they are different in kind, not just in degree. And I think the microaggression language suggests that they're only different in degree. And if it's if it's violence, then obviously you should do something about it. I'm not even sure that was the original formulation or intent of the guy who came up with the term microaggressions. I think there's some, usefulness to thinking about, what are the things that I'm just making assumptions about that might be hurtful to other people. But I think where the real error is that many of the things that are labeled microaggressions there's no intent, there's no aggressive intent behind them, right? And so it's hard to say, like, if somebody sideswipes you on the road, that's bad. It can be very destructive. But they didn't mean, it's not aggressive because they didn't mean to do it. Like, nobody was targeting you. It's sort of to bring it back to that. And so I think it makes a mistake in that sense, and some of the one, some of them, really are very rude type of things, but other ones say, one of the traditional ones I think University of California puts in is, I believe the best qualified person should get the job. The vast majority of people who are saying that are not reading some other, subtext into that, and may have no consciousness of it. So to call it aggressive, I think it is misleading. And so, it's rare that we've seen a university actually say you can't engage in microaggressions. Generally, it's in the form of you shouldn't, or it might be a bias incident that's not punishable or something like that. But nevertheless, I think it is sort of table setting for greater regulation of people's speech.
Yeah, and there obviously is a move afoot too, not just to describe speech as microaggressive, but as violent, and to say speech is violence. Yeah. And one thing that does, right? So it used to be in, say, like late 90s, early 2000s, the claim was, well, certain speech can be harmful, and you need to balance the harms of that speech, kind of, almost like the harassment, hostile work environment that the speech engenders. You have to balance that against free speech, right? But when you say it's violent, right, and that it just is violence, you kind of avoid even having the discussion about how you balance. You just say, well, I mean, it's violent. How can you tolerate violence? We don't allow violence in any circumstance. So, yeah, I think it's a rhetorical move to shut down speech. I think it's bad. I think microaggressions push us in that direction. If I had my way, universities would not ever use the term officially and would discourage others from doing so. We don't live in my ideal world.
And for perhaps a final question, this one comes from a student. What can we as students at Yale do to protect our free speech on campus?
Well, first of all, if you are in trouble for something you say, you should come to fire. That's an obvious one. If you get in trouble, support. I mean, the most important thing they can do is this is largely a norm setting situation. This sort of thing is tolerated because people tolerate it. And so, one of the disappointing but also understandable things is that I see over and over when people get in trouble for something controversial, people will privately come to them and say, hey, I'm really sorry this is happening, but nobody wants to come out in public and support someone. It is costly. It is tough. It's more costly and tough for people in school now than it was for me. And I'm conscious of that. But at the same time, if people don't start doing that, if they don't stand up for friends and allies and simply just colleagues, this will continue. And, any one of us could be next because, sometimes it's just like a roulette wheel that comes up, with your number on it. So, coming out and actually being in support of people is the only way this is actually going to turn around. But, to the extent that, you might actually be facing punishment, et cetera, coming to a place like FIRE can be helpful too.
I would just say, if you're a student accused of something like this, or you're become the target of a cancel culture mob, document everything, or at least document everything you can within the reasonable ethical limits. I I don't necessarily want to encourage people to record every private conversation. That might not be a great norm, but certainly keep emails, keep screenshots, have a record that you can show to fire, that you can, if need be, show to the media, that you just have so that it is clear what actually happened. Because,
Yeah.
you know, if you're characterized in public as, you know, Trent Colbert sent a really racist incident, you know, sent really racist email, and then the email is what it is, like, you should have a record of that and be able to show people this is what they called, you know, an appalling act of white supremacy. Like, here's my email. I mean, and that is good to have.
Great. And with that, we'll wrap this event up. Thank you so much to Aaron and Robert for doing the important work of reporting and acting on this incident, for taking the time to speak to the Buckley program. And thank you to all of our audience members for your great questions. Have a good rest of your evening.